Hi, everyone. Niagara-on-the-Lake is known for its picturesque setting at the mouth of the Niagara River. Its historic forts and buildings, theaters, and the surrounding viniculture industry. Thus, it seems unlikely that it was ever a railway town. However, in earlier times, the town was served by two railways. One was a steam railway owned and operated by a U.S. railroad, and you can see a photo of their station in the back. That is the Michigan Central Railroad Station. And the other was an interurban electric owned by a Canadian company. Both railways had their own separate parallel tracks running through the center of the town. This is an account of investment and change of which virtually nothing can be seen today. The talk will explore the beginnings of the railway dating back to 1854 and the resulting economic and strategic benefits it had for travel, tourism, industry, agriculture, and the military up until its closure in 1959. Other topics such as railway safety, construction, and equipment will be included, and the talk will utilize period maps and many black and white photographs. The presentation is being given by Peter Mulcaster. Peter is originally from the UK, where he studied and trained as an engineer. Peter came to Canada in 1966 and has spent his career working as a professional engineer. His career has taken him to Quebec for 3 years, but he spent most of his time in the Toronto area, where he worked on computer and information and technology industry for 35 years. Peter retired in 2011 and moved to Niagara-on-the-Lake and has taken up an interest in local history. He has written a book on the railway history of Niagara-on-the-Lake titled Off to Paradise Grove. He is now working on his second book, writing an account of the building of the Sir Adam Beck first generating station at Queenston from 1917 to 1922. Peter is also a member of the Canadian Railroad Historical Association Niagara Division.
Okay, I hope that I'll make a start. I hope that everyone can hear me and see the presentation. Just to begin with, so that we know where we are, because I'm not quite sure where everyone else is from. Here's just a general map of the area that you'll probably hear me talking about. There's Toronto, Hampton, Windsor, Detroit, Cleveland, Upper New York State, Rochester, Buffalo, and I'm going to be talking about Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is right here. It's in Ontario, and it's right at the mouth of where the Niagara River flows from Lake Erie into Lake Ontario. Niagara Falls is about halfway down between Buffalo and the entrance into Lake Ontario. And this line here represents the international boundary between the US and Canada. It's also the path of the Niagara River. And opposite Niagara-on-the-Lake on the US side is, over the other side of the river, is Youngstown, New York. So an introduction to Niagara-on-the-Lake. Some of you may know it, may not, but this is the center of the town. This is the main street, Queen Street here, with the cenotaph in the middle. On the left-hand side is the courthouse building, built in 1847. Just a bit further along the street is an intersection where King Street crosses Queen Street and goes down to the lake, which is right down at the end of the street here. This building here is a museum, apothecary museum. It used to be a drugstore. And on this side over here is a park called Simcoe Park. This is what it looked like in about 1920. We had two railway lines running down the main street here. So, in effect, Niagara-on-the-Lake was a railroad town. Here's the building that I just talked about, the apothecary. It was a drugstore called Coyne's Drugstore, and the park is still over here on this side. You've got a bit of a view of the lake down there. But this, on this side here, was a steam railway line run by Michigan Central Railroad. And then on this side, to the left of it was an interurban electric railroad called the the Niagara, St. Catharines, and Toronto Railway, which ran between Niagara-on-the-Lake and St. Catharines, Ontario. And then the steam railroad ran down from Niagara-on-the-Lake to Niagara Falls, right down into Buffalo. So I'm going to talk about early development of the railroad around Niagara-on-the-Lake, and then eventually the steam came, and then the electric came. Talk quickly about railroad safety, and then economic benefits, and then legacy. Really, that's what's left of the railroad in town. So first of all, a little bit of a history lesson. Um, there was initially horse-drawn railway opened in 1839. It was called the Erie and Ontario Railroad. It ran from Queenston to Chippewa, Ontario. And Queenston is just a bit further down the river from Niagara-on-the-Lake. There were steamers coming over from Toronto in that era. They stopped at Niagara-on-the-Lake and then went to Queenston. And then Chippewa is above the falls on the Niagara River. So you're wondering, why was this railroad put in place? Well, the railroads developed much later in Canada than they did in the United States. And so railroads were more prolific in the United States in the mid 1900s. And people who wanted to travel in the United States from Toronto area, they would take the steamer over to Queenston and get on the horse-drawn railroad and go down to Chippewa, which was above the falls. They get on a ferry from Chippewa to Buffalo, and once they got to Buffalo, they could then go to eastern U.S., New York, and Boston, or they could go to points west. Um, the Hamilton brothers that opened this, they got a charter to convert it to a steam railway, but they ran out of money, so they were bought out by a railroad entrepreneur called Samuel Zimmerman. And he actually opened up the steam railroad in July of 1854, but he extended it up to Niagara-on-the-Lake. It still went down to Chippewa. There was still a ferry down to Buffalo. And that was actually the third steam railway in Ontario. So it was still a very early railroad in Toronto. It was further enhanced in 1855 when there's a suspension bridge built over the Niagara River, which connected Canada to the US by railroad. And so people could get off there and also make connections to the United States. Another entrepreneur called William Thompson came along in 1860 and made another little railroad which went from Chippewa to Fort Erie. Fort Erie is opposite Buffalo. So you could now take the railroad, albeit with a change at Chippewa, right down to Fort Erie. Fort Erie was opposite Buffalo, take the ferry over to Buffalo. He then bought out the Erie and Ontario Railroad and called it the Erie and Niagara. And so by 1863, you could then just stay on the train and go all the way from Niagara-on-the-Lake to Fort Erie. He also very quickly ran out of money and leased the railway lines to Great Western Railroad. And there was some thought they may buy it, but they didn't. When they decided they weren't going to buy it, another railway bought it called Canada Southern. This is a very well established railway in southern Ontario. It ran all the way from Fort Erie, which is opposite Buffalo, all the way to Windsor, Ontario, which is opposite Detroit, served southern Ontario and had its headquarters in St. Thomas. Here's a picture of Samuel Zimmerman. He came from the United States, from Pennsylvania. He was 27 when he came to Canada and quickly established himself as an entrepreneur and did contract work on the second Welland Canal, and also then got involved in building railroads in Canada. Became very wealthy. Had a hotel, a bank, owned lots of land. Unfortunately, he died in 1857 in a railroad accident. He was only 42 years of age at the time. So, as I mentioned, here's a map of the area and explaining a bit why this railway developed. Originally, as I said, it went from Queenston, it was a horse-drawn railroad down to Chippewa. Here's Niagara Falls right here. So Chippewa was above the falls. So people would come by steamer to Queenston, get on the horse-drawn railroad, go to Chippewa, take a ferry all the way down to Buffalo so they could make connections in the US. Then this got established as a railroad going all the way down here. And then I think it was 1872, a bridge was built across to Buffalo, so there was a direct connection. Here are a couple of advertisements for the Erie and Ontario Railroad, which opened in 1854. It was about a 1 hour steam train ride from Niagara on the Lake to Chippewa. And if you look here, it would have cost you $2 to from Buffalo to Toronto all the way. So by ferry, a train, and then by steamship over to Toronto. Here is a watercolor print of from 1854 of Niagara on the Lake, and it shows the railroad. There's some also main sites that are still existing in Niagara on the Lake, which you can see today. That's Fort Mississauga there. That's St. Andrew's Church. That's the courthouse, which we saw on Main Street. That's St. Andrew's Church. That is St. Vincent de Paul Church. Here is a warehouse, which was built in 1834. It still exists. And here is a little railroad station. What's important, you can see here the railway line coming down King Street, making a turn and coming down about a 1% grade as it comes into the station here. So it's one of the earliest exhibits that demonstrates that the railway was actually in town in 1854, and gives you some idea of the effect it must have had on the town at the time. Here's the first picture actually that I have of a train. This is not until 1879. But this would have been a train running from Niagara on the Lake to Buffalo. This was run by Canada Southern. This is a wood-burning locomotive with two cars. And this is at a stop called Fallsview in Niagara Falls. And the train stopped here for tourist purposes, for people to see the falls. You can see the falls right here. Here is the old suspension bridge over here, which is the railroad bridge. Here's actually a hotel called the Clifton House Hotel, which is actually opened by Samuel Zimmerman. I believe this photograph was taken from the windows of the convent that exists. So a bit more of history. In 1876, Canada Southern itself was in financial difficulty, so it was bought out by Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a huge railroad czar in the U.S., founder of New York Central. Why did he take it over? I bought it actually 30 cents on the dollar, so it was a really, really good deal for him. But what it gave him, it was a really strategic move because, as I said, Canada Southern ran from Fort Erie over to Windsor. Both those towns were opposite major cities in the US. linked to Buffalo via the bridge, and also a tunnel over to Detroit. And he bought this because it saved New York Central a lot of time getting to Detroit. So if you got on a train from New York to Detroit, you'd have to go along the north shore of Lake Erie through Cleveland, Toledo, and then up to Detroit. Whereas cutting across southern Ontario, it saved about 120 miles or 190 kilometers, and that would have been like 3 to 4 hours of traveling time. So it was a strategic move. A couple of years later, his sons did a proxy takeover of the Michigan Central Railroad. Michigan Central Railroad ran a substantial railway network in Michigan, which covered all of Michigan. And at that time, they leased the lines of Canada Southern to Michigan Central, and eventually Canada Southern was merged in 1883 into Michigan Central. And so that meant the railroad coming into Niagara-on-the-Lake and going down to Buffalo was owned and operated by New York Central, but actually operated by the Michigan Railroad, Central Railroad. And the heyday of the railway was really from about the 1880s up till about the beginning of the First World War. It was quite a busy line. There were up to 5 trains a day between Niagara-on-the-Lake and Buffalo all year round. It was played as a central role during the First World War, but after the First World War, transportation with automobiles started becoming more and more prevalent, and so in 1826 here they closed down the passenger service and closed down the line to Fort Erie. And then thereafter, from that time, it was just freight. Initially, there was probably 2 to 3 freight trains a day, but through time, when it actually closed in 1959, it was probably down to 1 small freight train a week, if that. So it was almost disappearing into nothing, just based on what happened in the town, and also road transportation took over. So here's a couple of exhibits. Here is a Michigan Central advertisement for the line. And it says the short direct line between Niagara-on-the-Lake and Buffalo. And it says the train stopped for 5 to 10 minutes at Fallsview Station to be able to see Niagara Falls. And it mentions here Paradise Grove on the bank of Niagara River, a beautiful location. So there were excursions that used to come up during the weekend from Buffalo to Paradise Grove, and people would come up and spend time in Paradise Grove, which is a beautiful wooded area, and have picnics there during the summer. Here's a ticket here, and you can if you can see it, it would have cost you 55 cents to ride the train from Buffalo to Niagara Falls. Quite a deal in those days. Here's a view of the stop at what was called Fallsview. This would actually been a mainline train coming from New York to Detroit, because it's much bigger than the trains that came to Niagara-on-the-Lake. But you can see how nicely manicured this area is. Train stopped here. We got a beautiful view over the falls. I believe this building up here is just part of the Loretto Academy. And you can still see this view today. If you go to Stanley Avenue, get off at Livingstone, it comes right up to the top of this embankment, and you can still see the view and the railway line down below Niagara Falls, and see a view of the falls. It's still quite a spectacular view. Here's a picture of the railroad line as it came into Niagara on the lake in the early 1900s. The line came up from Niagara Falls, split into 2. One line went across here and then down King Street all the way to the dock. And then the other line branched off and went into, can't read this very well, but that says Paradise Grove. And this is the wooded area where they had picnics. But this time, this was Fort George is here. Queen Street is right here. Um, this was a military reserve or training camp for the military. Military put in another connecting line between these two lines so it could serve the military camp, and this is called the military railway. There was it for a short period of time, an extension over to the western part of Niagara on the Lake, which was called Chautauqua. There was a Chautauqua assembly over there where they would meet for the summer and have their meetings and get-togethers. Here's what the railway looks like in terms of the dock area, where the ships would come over and dock here from Toronto. The railway came down this line here from the town. This King Street would be over here off the edge of the left-hand side of this chart. Um, when the train came down, it stopped here just before uh, this cutoff here. They disconnected the locomotive, and the locomotive went towards a turntable, and then the conductor on the train released the brake. And because this was a slope here, the passenger cars coasted down into the station. And the reason they did that is so that they could turn water the train, add some coal to it, and turn it around on the turntable, and then bring the locomotive back out. They'd reverse the locomotive back down here, and so it would connect up with the rest of the train. There was an interesting story I came across was that one that sometimes the last train at night, the locomotive stayed over here in the engine house until the morning. And in the late 1800s, before the dock here had a foghorn and lights, if it was foggy and there was a ship coming over, steamer coming over, and it had difficulty seeing its way into the dock here, they bring the locomotive right out onto the turntable and point it out over the river, and it would turn on its headlight and it would blow its steam whistle so to help guide in the ships to the dock. I'm going to just take you on a quick virtual tour of what it was like to ride this railroad. This was one of the major steamships that used to come over. There were 4 to 5 of them. This is called the Cuyahoga. This is the Cuyahoga leaving the Eastern Gap in the Toronto Harbor. And this is what it would look like the ship arriving at the dock. Here's a train waiting to connect with the steamer. Here's a little station. Here's a refreshment booth. And this is a warehouse here. And this is one of the guiding lights right there. Once this is a photograph of the ship docked up against the dock here, and we're looking down at the railroad station. You can see the train right here with this locomotive, and I always think how nicely people were dressed in those days. No torn off jeans or anything like that. People dressed to the hilt with their bowler hats and ties and jackets, and look very smart. Here's the front of the train ready to go. There's the station in the background. We do know one of these people here was Edward Keith, this gentleman here. He was a fireman who worked for Michigan Central. He lived very close by on Delater Street in Niagara on the Lake, and later worked himself up to be a railroad engineer. And this is one of the old hotels, just as you're leaving the station, called the Lakeview House Hotel. This building unfortunately burnt down mysteriously in 1989 and was replaced with condominiums. But here we are coming up the grade from the station. There's about a 1% grade. This is Delatcher Street here, and there was a bridge. You can just make out the initials MCRR on the bridge coming up to town. And then here we are coming through town. I had a friend who's an automobile expert, and he identified this as a Ford Model T, so we know it's about 1920. And right in here, of course, is the line for the electric train. Here we are, we're now left town and we're starting to go up the Niagara Escarpment. Niagara Escarpment is the big piece of geology that forms Niagara Falls. It's an abrupt rise of about 200 feet. So this is crossing York Road at Queenston and about a 2% grade. And this is about the maximum grade that you ever want on railways because steam engines can't pull up more than about 2%. In fact, there were some stories of trains getting stuck on the grade going up here. Here we are crossing the river at Chippewa, where the old railway just used to go to. And this is headed southbound going towards Buffalo. And here we are, we have a photograph of the Union Depot Railroad Station in Buffalo, where the train would terminate its journey. I'm going to switch now to the electric train network and the NS&T, the Niagara, St. Catharines and Toronto Railway. It was a very adventurous sort of name. It had hoped to connect itself eventually with Toronto, but it never did. But at that time, there was a big thing in Canada and also in the US for what they called radial railways. These were small interurban electric railways that linked small communities with electric railways. It was used for passenger service. Some freight was carried, but mostly for passenger service. The NS&T started life in St. Catharines as a horse-drawn, just urban streetcar service in the town. By 1887, it was electrified and gradually expanded. It expanded down to Port Dalhousie and then expanded up to the next town, Thorold, went over to Niagara Falls, into Niagara Falls, expanded southwards down to Fonthill, Welland, Port Coburn, and then in 1913 extended out to Niagara-on-the-Lake. So it was a pretty substantial interurban network of electric rail cars. People ask me today, well, why can't we get this going again? Because, you know, for environmental concerns, we would have all this, you have to handle this commuter traffic, but sadly, all of the railway rights of way are gone and all the infrastructure is gone. There's no cars or anything like that existing. I will mention another little electric railway that was in place between Queenston and Niagara Falls. It actually was a circular railroad. It had several names, NFP&R, Niagara Falls Park and River Railway. It then became called the International Railway, and it operated on both sides of the river. So on the Canadian side, it operated at the top of the gorge, and on the US side in New York, it operated at river level. So it was a fantastic attraction for tourists in the area because you could ride right by the roaring, raging rapids of the Niagara River. It was also called the Great Gorge Route at that time. Here's just a photograph of it at Queenston because the steamers came up from Niagara-on-the-Lake and they stopped. And this was actually a good way to get to Niagara Falls for tourists for the day. They would take the electric streetcar and go into Niagara Falls, or they could cross over the river. There was a suspension bridge over here and tour around the Niagara River. Here you can see Brock's Monument up here, and you can just see the steeple of St. Saviour's Church at Queenston. So back to Niagara-on-the-Lake. Here's the first electric car in Niagara-on-the-Lake in November 1913. This railway here is the steam railway line, and this here is the NS&T. I think it probably would have been inconvenient, not probably that practical, because this was an electric railway, and generally steam railways didn't like to run on electric railway lines. You can see here what's called the pole here. This is the electric wire overhead, the catenary. That would have been 600 volts DC up there. But this was the service, and this is right at Queen Street right here, crossing and then going down to the river there. So this is the first car in Niagara-on-the-Lake in 1913. How it came into Niagara-on-the-Lake, it went came from central St. Catharines downtown along Niagara Street, Fraser Street. It had a right of way down to the lakeshore, ran along Lakeshore Road until McNabb, and then a town line road went through across the country, and then came across some agricultural land into Niagara-on-the-Lake on King Street. So here's a map, 1920, showing the railways in Niagara-on-the-Lake at that time. The red is still, of course, the steam, the Michigan Central, and the green line coming in here is the NS&T. Just a few pictures, a virtual little trip on the NS&T. Once again, this is at King and Queen. You can see the roof of the drugstore over here. This must have been a summer excursion, because we have a car hauling 4 trailers with people in their Sunday best out for the day, coming to Niagara-on-the-Lake. Here is the train leaving town. Not the same train, obviously, but this is just a little bit south of Queen Street, and here is the NS&T station. And it's a wooden structure, and luckily it still exists today. It's the only remaining railway structure left in town. It's actually been restored and serves as a coffee house called Bozak's Coffee House. Here we are with the train running across Trestle at McNabb on its way into St. Catharines. And then this is another photograph running across another trestle. When they were building the Fourth Welland Canal in the 1920s, this became at the time what was thought to be an ocean-going canal between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. So it was a huge venture. Eventually, you can see here the chasm that they're excavating for the canal. Eventually, once that was done, there was a proper bridge that was put in. I want to talk a little bit about railway accidents. They were much more prevalent in the 1800s. Railroads weren't that well regulated necessarily. Originally, railways were built with much lighter materials, lighter steel rails. They weren't necessarily well maintained. Originally, there was very little traffic on the railways. Gradually, they got more and more traffic. Signals became a problem. Not necessarily all lines had signals and were electrified with communications from one point to another. But on this day in 1857, March 12, a train was coming from Toronto here, crossing the Desjardins Canal. Dundas is at the end of the canal, and then it would have gone into Hamilton. And this was a wooden swing bridge. It was the bridge was able to swing to allow ships to go through here down to Dundas. And this train broke an axle as it was coming up to the bridge. As this is a wooden bridge, the broken axle, the reel came out of the wheels were out of alignment in the front, and they just ground through the railroad ties and eventually ground through the wooden structure. So the whole bridge collapsed and plunged into the frozen water. There were 105 people on the train, 60 died, about 20 were injured. Amongst those was Samuel Zimmerman. He was, of course, the entrepreneur um, who developed the Erie and Ontario Railway and lots of other railways. He died at the age of 42. And that's really what caused the demise of the railway in the financial demise of the railway in Niagara on the Lake, and it was then bought out by Thompson and later changed hands many times. It was a loss of a great entrepreneur in terms of development of railways in southern Ontario in the 1800s. Closer to home, there was an accident in 1913 on the between Queenston and Niagara on the Lake. There was a switch that was maliciously, apparently by some youths, that was put in the wrong direction, and the train came off the rails. The fireman died, unfortunately, was fatally injured and died a few days after. He's actually currently buried in St. Mark Cemetery of St. Mark's Church. But that was the only injury and fatality. And interestingly, the train and the coaches were all resurrected, put back on the tracks and repaired and put back into working order. Another very serious accident, I had mentioned the NFP&R or the Great Gorge route. Here's a picture. This wasn't the train that was involved in the accident, but this is very close to the place that it was where the accident occurred. And this was car 684. The actual car that was involved in the accident was number 685. So it would have looked exactly the same, and it would have been on the same grade. Now, this, because of electric trains can climb much steeper grades, this was almost a 7% grade coming down from Queenston Heights, where Brock's Monument is, down into Queenston. In July of 1915, there was a school outing up at Queenston Heights in the park there. There was a picnic and a whole lot of young school children. The rain started belting down. A train came along, and they thought, well, for protection from the rain and the storm, they all clambered on the train. Unfortunately, you can see this train looks rather crowded. Um, these trains had a capacity of 80 people, and actually there were 160 on the train. So as the train started to go down the slope, its electrical trolley came off the line up here. And so the motorman or the driver could not put the train into reverse. Then a bit further down the slope, the brakes failed, and the train on one of the curves going down into Queenston came off the line and rolled over, and 15 people died. And out of the 160 on the train, there were about 90 people who were injured. So it was a pretty serious accident. After that date, these open trains with no sides were banned, and you had to have totally closed in rail cars after that. Now I'm going to move on and talk about the economic effects and benefits. Tourism, agriculture, fishing, through industrial and through World War One. Niagara on the Lake in the late 1800s was even then was a big tourist destination. It had about 8 major hotels. One of the landmark hotels built in 1869 was the Queen's Royal Hotel, had about 100 rooms. It was extremely well known. It was extremely, it was a destination in Niagara on the Lake. In fact, even royalty stayed there. Future King George and Queen Mary actually stayed there. And it survived till 1930 and then was torn down. But it was right on the right on the lake. Another big hotel was the Chautauqua Hotel, built in 1879, and but that was destroyed by fire in 1909. That was part of the Chautauqua Assembly, and that was a 60-room hotel. And you can see some of the activities, bowling and bathing in the river. If you look in the background here, this is just, you can see over here to New York State. This would have been Fort Niagara over here. Just down here would have been Youngstown, New York. So it was, there were up to 10,000 people coming in summer weekends. There were up to 5 steamships coming across from Toronto, some twice a day. So it was a very popular destination, and because of its transportation connections, it helped promote that activity. Here is a view of Paradise Grove. Some pictures. It's a very mature forested area with many mature oak trees, for example. People would have picnics. There was a carousel. Here's a view here. There was a pavilion as well. I don't have a picture of that, but supposedly in the pavilion, there was dancing and light beer was available. I don't know why it was just light beer, why they didn't have any other beer, but it was advertised as light beer was being available. But of course, not on Sundays. It was only on, I think, some days in the week and on Saturdays. Here is just a quick map. Here's the railway line coming from Queenston. You can see Queenston there. There's a river, and that's where it splits. But you'll notice there's a couple of spurs coming off the line, and these served a couple of fruit farms. This was for the Larkin farm, and that was for the Fisher farm. And here's a photograph of the railway serving the fruit industry. So here we have 6 refrigerator cars, and you can see here during season they were loading peaches. So because of the subclimate here, we're lucky that this area can support the growth of commercial levels of strawberries, raspberries, cherries, and then later in the season in August, nectarines, peaches, and the industry is still quite substantial. And that day, they didn't have trucks, so they loaded it on refrigerator cars. And you can see this is a spur off the main line that I mentioned from the previous map. Once you have a fruit industry, of course, you have a canning industry as well. That was very big, and that was supported by the railways. We have a label here for the Union Jack Canning Company. None of these companies are in existence any longer, but that was actually in the parking lot where the Prince of Wales Hotel is today. There was the Delhi Canning Company down in the docking area, which was bought out by Canadian Canners, and then moved up to John Street, and this employed about 200 people in its heyday in the 1930s. And this actually now is the Pillar and Post Hotel. So they've done a beautiful job in converting this warehouse factory type buildings, which are in red brick, into the Pillar and Post Hotel. And this was a picture of the canning company in St. David's called Lowry's, which is also taken over by Canadian Canners. There was also a fourth cannery on 4 Mile Creek Road. So canning was big industry as well, served by the railways. The other big in industry was fishing. Lake Ontario in the 1800s was an incredible food source for fish. There was available in the lake where salmon, trout, lake herring, whitefish, and initially it just served as a food source for local communities. But when the railways came in, then it grew commercially. And here's a picture. Here's the railway line right on the front coming down into the dock area. Here's some fishing huts here with frames here where they dried the nets on. But here's a passenger car at the railway station at the dock. But here is a refrigerator car. So once refrigerator cars were invented, that meant that fish from here could be shipped, and it went as far as Montreal, Chicago, New York, could be packed up in ice and then shipped in refrigerated cars. And the heyday of that was from the late 1800s up to about 1920. And they were getting about 500 tons of fish a season. So that was a lot of fish that was, but it was a fairly substantial business in town with a lot of people involved in it. But because the exploitation of the fishery, it got overfished. By about 1925, the level of fish being fished had dropped precipitously from about 500 tons down to 5 tons. By 1930, it was down to about zero. So because of the railways, in a way, it developed the fishing industry, but then caused it to overexploit itself. And in fact, in the end, the overfishing was its demise. Another big industry that was in town was in the dock area. This was a photograph from 1865 showing the dock. Here's the warehouse that was built in 1834. Here's a little railway station that was on the dock. And these buildings here, these three buildings were built and founded by Samuel Zimmerman. You remember him. And he built railway cars here, freight cars, and some passenger cars. They built up to 100 cars a year and employed over 100 people. And this developed and thrived very well because Samuel Zimmerman had a lot of connections in the railroad business. He was involved in developing other railways. So he was the he had the contacts to be able to sell the product that was built here. However, after his death and the accident, as we previously reviewed, it just declined and went out of business. And by about 1865, the business doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. Another big business that was in town up and in fact up until about 1980 to some degree, particularly prevalent though in the 1920s, was dredging for sand in the mouth of the Niagara River. Here's a dock area. Over here would be the New York side. But because of the large construction projects, the Fourth Welland Canal and the Sarambet 1 generating station, they required huge amounts of sand to make concrete. And the sand that was dredged from the mouth of the river was ideal. It had the ideal granularity, and of course, it was washed by fresh water. So it was very pure and very good. And they sometimes there are up to 4 dredges working in the river. And during the height of the building of the Sir Allan Beck 1 generating station, they were pulling out up to 5,000 tons of sand a day from the river. And there were about 20 trains a day going up through the town loaded with sand to make concrete for the Sir Allan Beck 1 generating station project. So that was and that continued on and off to varying degrees right up till 1980. So it's a common sight to see these dredgers working 24 hours a day, noisily, sucking up sand from the river. And of course, it also destroyed fishing beds and cons- completely changed the flow of the river at the mouth. And what had been sandy beaches where people could bathe, that all disappeared. So it had a major change on the environment for the river. Another industry, which is fairly short-lived, though, was on the escarpment going up from St. David's was the Usher Cement Works. This is the escarpment going up here. They found natural rock cement, and it was then transported into this. There was a kiln up here where it was fired, and then once it was fired, it chemically changed. It was ground up into a fine powder, and they shipped out. In its peak, it was making about 40 tons of cement a day to make concrete, and that lasted up to 1905. The natural concrete made with this cement took 24 hours to cure. And then in 1905 or thereabouts, Portland cement was invented, and it only took 6 hours. So they went out of business. But everyone feels that the concrete made with the natural base cement was far superior to the stuff made with Portland cement. Last but not least was the contribution to World War One by the railway. As I said, the big grassy space that exists in Niagara on the Lake today is called the Common, was a military camp dating back from the Fort George days, served during the 1812-14 war. Um, was because of the transportation, the steamer and the 2 railways coming into town, became an ideal hub for training recruits into soldiers for World War One. Canada contributed and shipped about 620,000 troops over to Europe to serve in World War One, and about 80,000 of those came through the Niagara camp. Um, and they went on a training course of about 13 weeks, trained from recruits into soldiers. And you can see some photographs here of them getting ready to board trains, and the trains taking off. And then they would take the train and go up to Niagara Falls, and then on to Toronto and probably Montreal, to board ships to cross over to Europe. But it was there was a huge amount of activity during World War One. There was some activity also in World War Two, but not certainly as significant as World War One. Now I'm going to just switch to the last part, and this is what's left, the legacy of the railroads. You saw this picture before, and it had various infrastructure items. Here's a culvert, turntable, and engine house. The culvert still exists today. There are remains from the turntable and the engine house, and there's only 2 buildings left: the warehouse and a hotel, which used to be called the American Hotel. We'll take a look at this. So this railway right away comes down from King Street from a slope here. So my first picture here is the railway right of way as it runs along the waterfront. Now, this used to be on an embankment, but the embankment has been removed, but is now a recreational trail along by the river. And we actually have arranged to put a plaque in to denote that. Here is the culvert. This is a little stream that used to run through here. The railway ran on top of this. This is what it looked like before it was restored. Um, and here's a picture of the town restored the culvert in 2018, did a beautiful job and also landscaped the area around it. So the path that you can take from King Street off Delater Street runs across this little culvert where the railway used to run. Here is what remains of the turntable. There are some outer stones. I've included this picture here, which shows not the same railroad, a different railroad in Pembroke, Ontario, but it's the same type. There was a pit here. There was an outer foundation wall that you can see the stones here. This would represent this wall here. And this was a manual turntable. This was a manual table also. So you can see here the outer stones, the foundation is the inside has been filled in, and then someone's made a little garden here. We do have a plaque mounted there to denote this. Unfortunately, about 50% of the stones were removed by the town to do some drain repair work. And we're currently working with the town to replace those stones and put them back in. But these are very, very substantial stones, actually quarried from a local quarry at Queenston. Here is, so the turntable is down, here's this road along here. This is where the railway would have run in down here into the dock area. This is where the turntable was. And then there was a line coming up to the engine house. What's left of the engine house is the repair pit. The engine house was about 40 foot wide, so it was wide enough for two locomotives. It went down to this street here, so it was about 75 foot long. It was a wooden structure, but they had this concrete structure in the center, which was an inspection pit. There were some steps going down here. Of course, this is not filled in. So technicians could go down the steps and work underneath the locomotive as required. We actually were successful in having PGM Rail Services install the rails as they would have been back on the repair pit. So that was done in 2021. We've also put a plaque in there. Here we have the waterfront now. The train would have come along here and stopped in front of the warehouse. The little station would have been right here. So the two existing buildings, the warehouse is still there, built in 1834. And this hotel, which was called the American Hotel, is the only existing other building, but I understand it's going to be torn down and replaced by condos. I did show you a photograph of Lake House, the Lake House Hotel, which was here, which mysteriously burned and was replaced by condos starting in 1998. The NS&T station, as I mentioned earlier, was the only remaining railroad building in town. Here it is today. It's been beautifully restored. It's actually owned privately and it was restored privately. They've done a beautiful job and it's now a coffee house, as you can see with the chairs outside it. So this is the last slide. This is picture of Paradise Grove today, what it looks like, so you have an idea what it may have looked like in earlier times. It's There are some signs of the railway, but you have to know where they are. And there's no, of course, rails in there, but there are some earth structures that you can see, which are not natural, which would have been caused by a construction of the railway. So that's the last slide. And I'm good. This also is the book that I published on it. Unfortunately, the book is actually all sold out. Unfortunately, there is a version of it up on Amazon Kindle. And if also any of you want to communicate with me, there's my email address or ask any questions. And I'll also let those of you who are interested know when my book on the Anabac Generation Station's coming out. Might be next end of next year. Anyway, I think that's all I have to say. If